going to be covering the graphs of sine and cosine. So on here, a sine wave or sinusoid is a graph of the sine function in trigonometry. In addition to mathematics, this function also occurs in other fields of study such as science and engineering. This wave pattern also occurs in nature as seen in ocean waves, sound waves, and light waves. Average daily temperatures for each day of the year resemble this wave. So they give you examples of the different kind of waves, the average temperature, the light waves, the sound waves. So here we have our unit circle. So the unit circle is a source for the generation of the trigonometric function graphs. The quadrants from the unit circle, when placed horizontally in numerical order, create the basis for the trigonometric graphs. This process of creating graphs from the unit circle is often called unwrapping the unit circle. So the graph of the sine function, it says use the unit circle to complete the table of values. So as we learned in a previous lesson, the sine is our y values, okay? So we're going to go ahead and check our y value at 0 degrees. So at 0 degrees, our y value here is 0. Okay. At pi over 4, our y value here is the square root of 2 over 2. That as a decimal, I'm going to put it now as a decimal because it's easier to graph. It's going to be 0.707. At 3 pi over 4, pi over 2, I'm sorry. I skipped one. At pi over 2, our y value is 1. At 3 pi over 4, our y value is the square root of 2 over 2, but as a decimal, that's 0.707. At pi, our y value here is 0. At 5 pi over 4, my y value is negative square root of 2 over 2, which is going to end up being negative 0.707. At 3 pi over 2, my y value is negative 1. At 7 pi over 4, my y value is the negative square root of 2 over 2. So it's going to be negative 0.707. And then at 2 pi, my y value is back at 0. So I'm going to go ahead and graph that. So at 0, we have a point at 0. At a quarter pi, it's going to be 0.7. Oops. No, I did that. At half a pi, it's at 1. At 3 pi over 4, it's at 0.7. At pi, it is at 0. Then at the next one, we have 0.7. At 3 pi over 2, it's negative 1. And then at 7 pi over 4, it's negative 0.7, so it would be about right here. And then back to 0 again. So then our wave looks something like this. Okay. And so that is considered one cycle, and our little graph repeats over and over. So I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing from here to here. It goes up like this, comes back down, and then you have these points that are at 0.7. So our graph for sine looks like this. All right. So now the graph of the cosine function, it says use the unit circle to complete the table of values. So now we know from the previous lessons that cosine is equal to our x value. So at 0 degrees, my x value here is 1. At pi over 4, my x value here is the square root of 2 over 2. But remember, I'm going to put it as a decimal because it's easier to graph. At pi over 2, my x value is 0. At 3 pi over 4, my x value is the negative square root of 2 over 2, so that'll be negative 0.707. At pi, my x value is negative 1. At 5 pi over 4, my x value is the negative square root of 2 over 2, so that's going to be negative 0.707. At 3 pi over 2, my x value is 0. At 7 pi over 4, my x value is the square root of 2 over 2, so that's a positive 0.7. And then at 2 pi, we made one full circle and ended up back at 1. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and graph that at 0. We have 1. At pi over 4, we have 0.7. At pi over 2, it's 0. At 3 pi over 4, it is negative 0.7. At pi, it is 1. At another, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. 0.7, this is 0, 0.7, and then back to 1. So now I'm going to go ahead and connect the dots. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Oops. I'm going to make the exact same shape. It starts up like this, comes back down, and then goes back up. Okay. All right, so now there are some special vocabulary or special things about our sine and cosine graphs. Okay, so we have one thing, it's called the amplitude. The amplitude will tell you the height of the wave, but the height comes from the midline to the height of the wave. So if we look here, this is my midline right here. And the amplitude would be this piece right here. Amplitude is 1, amplitude is 2. Okay. Then you have your cycles. So our cycle of our sine function is like this little snake shape, and the cycle of our cosine shape is a U. So when they're asking you for the cycle, this would be one cycle. Okay, this would be considered one cycle. Okay, and a lot of the times they'll ask you, well, what's the period? Okay, well, the period is how long does it take to complete that one cycle. So here from 0 to 2 pi is how long it took them to complete one cycle. Here from 0 to 4 pi, that's how long it took them to complete one cycle. All right, so transformations. Now, if we go ahead and multiply by a number up here in the front, that is, that's going to change our amplitude. So the first one says, graph the following function on the domain from 0 to 2 pi. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my cosine function. My cosine starts at 1. It takes from 0 to 2 pi, that's how long it takes to complete one cycle. So my cosine function is kind of like a little U shape, if you remember. And so now they want us to go ahead and take that and multiply it times 2. So instead of this point being at 1, 1 times 2 gives us 2. Okay. Instead of this point being at 0, well, 0 times 2 is still 0. Instead of this one being at negative 1, negative 1 times 2, it's going to give me negative 2. So it's going to be all the way down here. Here at 0, 0 times 2 is still going to give me 0. And then here, 1 times 2 is going to give me 2. So this one, if you notice, this is what our graph looks like. Okay. But the last one, what if we go ahead and instead we're going to multiply 1/2 times cosine? So now this point that's at 1, if we multiply it times 1/2, it ends up at 1/2 here. Okay. This one that's at 0, well, 0 times 1/2 is still 0. And then we have negative 1/2, and we're back at 0, and then positive 1/2. I don't know why this is being weird. There. There you go. All right, so let's go ahead and write some key things on here. Range. Now, range is how low our graph goes and how high our graph goes. So on our y-axis, this one goes as low as negative 1 and as high as 1. So it's from negative 1 to 1. The range for this one, the lowest that our graph goes is negative 2, and the highest that it goes is positive 2. All right, this next one, the lowest that it goes right here is negative 1/2, and the highest would be positive 1/2. Okay, so the midline, the line that cuts the range in half. So if I cut this range in half, that would be my midline. It is at y equals 0. This line would cut my range in half. This one is also y equals 0. This one cuts my graph in half, or my range in half, I'm sorry. And that one's also y equal to 0. And then my amplitude, so from the midline to the peak. So here's my midline to the peak, that is 1 unit, so my amplitude is 1. Here from the midline to my peak, that's going to be 2 units. Here from my midline to my peak is only half a unit, which is this number here that's in the front. Okay. All right, so vertical shift, so we can move up or down depending if you're adding or subtracting a number. So graph the following functions on the domain from 0 to 2 pi. So starting with sine. Now sine starts at 0, 0, it comes up, then back down, then back up. And so this is what our sine function looks like. That's the original. I did forget midline on here, just so let me put it in here. Midline, it didn't come out. I don't know why. Midline. Okay. Now, if we take our sine function and we add 2, that means that we're going to move up 2. So instead of this point being at 0, 0, we move it up 2. Instead of this point being at 1, we're going to move it up 2 units and ends up at 3. Instead of this one being at 0, we move it up 2 units and it's at 2. Instead of this one being at -1, we move it up 2 units and it's at +1. And then this one that's at 0 moves up to 2. Okay, so that's a translation by adding 2. The next one, sine of x minus 1. So we take the original function sine and we move it down 1. So instead of being at 0, it's at -1. Instead of this one being at 1, it's at 0. Instead of this one's -1, then this goes down to -2 and then back to -1. And that's what our sine function looks like if we translate it 1 unit down. All right, so let's go ahead and get the range. The lowest that this graph goes is -1 and the highest is +1. Here on this one, the lowest that my graph goes is 1 and the highest that it goes is 3. So my range is between 1 and 3. And then the last one, the lowest my graph goes is -2 and the highest that it goes is positive, or just 0. Sorry, -2, 0. Okay, so the midline, we take the range and we cut it in half. So here my midline is y equals 0. I cut this one in half, and my midline is y equals 2. This one I cut it in half, and my midline is y equals -1. So next, let's find our amplitude. So my amplitude is how high this is, so that's going to be 1 from the midline to the peak. So here my amplitude is also 1, and here my amplitude is 1. Now from the equation, it's a number being multiplied times your sine function. It should be in the front. So all of these, there's no number there, so we automatically assume that it is a 1, right? The last section are reflections, so negative sine of x. So if I take sine of x, here's my original sine function. It looks like this. An arc up here, an arc down there. And so we take that and we multiply it times a negative. Okay? So what that says is all we got to do is reflect it across the x-axis. So instead of this arc being up here, it's going to be down here. And then instead of this arc being at the bottom, it's going to be at the top. Okay, so our range, how low and how high our graph goes. On both of them, the range stays exactly the same. So -1 to +1. -1 to +1. Now, since we didn't shift this graph either up or down, our midline stays the same. It's y equals 0. So midline, I'm going to put m out, is y equals 0. So then from there, we go from the midline to the peak, and that'll give me my amplitude. So my amplitude here is 1. From the midline to the peak, my amplitude is also 1. And that's it. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and drop it down below in the comments. Thank you guys. Bye.